So just a couple of additional housekeeping things now that we're back. If you ran out of cards or you don't have an index card and you still might like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and Erica will ensure you get a card so that you can ask your question. If you posed a question for the first panel and we didn't get to it, we are saving some of those questions. Each of our nights throughout October are themed, and some of the questions fit better with some of the other discussions we're going to have. So we hope to get to as many of those as we possibly can. But now that we've heard from two executives who are at the forefront of protecting press freedom here in the United States and around the world, let's hear from some of the people who are actually on the ground. Our next panel will introduce you to some of the journalists who are taking the risks, both legal and physical, to help bring important stories into the light. Please join me in welcoming, on my far right, Roman Anin. Roman is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. He is head of the investigative section of Moscow-based Novaya Gazeta, one of the most famous Russian newspapers in the world. His projects have revealed corruption in the military, politics, and business, including in construction contracts for the 2014 Winter Olympics. He was a member of the Panama Papers investigative team, which delved deeply into the financial dealings of offshore entities, political leaders, corporations, and business people. That investigation received the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting in 2017. To my immediate right is Joel Konopo. Joel, as well, is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. He is an investigative journalist and managing partner of the Inc. Center for Investigative Journalism, a nonprofit newsroom in Gaborone, Botswana. Prior to establishing Inc., Joel was the editor of the Botswana Guardian newspaper, and he also was part of the Panama Papers investigation. To my immediate left, Alejandra Xanic von Bertrab is an independent investigative journalist in Mexico. She has covered issues related to drug trafficking, state corruption, political assassinations, and human rights. She has worked in a range of Mexican media, and in 2013, she won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism for her work with New York Times reporter David Barstow on the use of multi-million-dollar bribes by Walmart in Mexico. And on my far left is R Venkatesh. Venkatesh is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. He has more than 16 years of experience as a journalist. He's worked on countering disinformation and bias and has worked to reinvent coverage of critical health and developmental issues. In 2015, he was the editor at The Quint, and before that, director of communications at change.org in India. He was also a senior anchor at CNN IBN for 9 years. He's also the founder of Metadata, a journalism project that seeks to bridge divides by creating safe spaces for debate. So, we're here to hear from these journalists who are on the front lines. Let's dive right in. My first question is for Roman. Roman, according to CPJ, 58 journalists have been killed in Russia since 1992. At least 5 journalists at your news organization have been murdered since 2000. Have you ever been personally threatened, and what steps have you taken to protect yourself and your loved ones?
I would like to start with my brave colleagues, and I knew some of them who were killed. There were no 5, but 4 members of the staff and 2 people who worked closely with us. And I think it's important to know their names. My section is named under the name of Yuri Shikachyhin. He is considered to be the father of investigative reporting in Russia, actually. And he was poisoned by, as we believe, secret services in Russia, because he reported a lot about corruption within the secret services. Then we had Igor Domnikov. He reported a lot about regional authorities, and he was killed by a very cruel organized gang. Then we had Anna Politkovskaya. She reported about Northern Caucasus, and she was shot down in near her apartment. And 2 people were shot down also in the streets in the center of Moscow. They reported about neo-Nazis. And then we had Natalia Stimirova, she also was killed for covering Northern Caucasus. So you see that the topics are quite different, and yeah, so people can do anything, but still, something can happen to them. But still I want to be, frankly, the situation is changing today. It's changing to the better, because the last attack on journalists in Moscow was a number of years ago. Oleg Kashin was beaten. And I'm talking now about national reporters, because in the regions, the situation is worse, but there is no any journalism. So the journalism in the Russian regions is dead, almost dead. And that is why, there is nothing even to say what's going on there. I faced threats a number of times, but I didn't consider them. I mean, twice we thought that they were serious, and there is only one recipe. In this case, you just leave the country immediately. So, don't want to exaggerate the problem which is in Russia, because many people think that this is like a war zone. It's not. I mean, it's still not a bad place for reporters. At least, I mean, many topics to cover. When the state is corrupt, so yeah, I mean, people from Sweden envy me, because there is nothing to cover in Sweden, while in Russia there is plenty of job. So for my 10 years of investigative reporting, I had to leave the country only twice, which is, I think, is not a kind of bad percentage.
Okay, thank you. So, and sort of naturally following it, let me turn to you, Xanic. Just less than 2 weeks ago, journalist Mario Leonel Gomez Sanchez was gunned down outside his home in Mexico. What steps do you take to protect yourself from physical threats?
I think, I'm basically very cautious. It's not like I feel under threat continuously. It's that when we work on difficult or tough stories, we do sort of higher the alert and become more careful. And being careful includes really just basic stuff like being very careful with your cell phone, with not having any important information or contact information in our cell phones that could put some other people or our sources at risk if somebody got to our cell phone, or being very careful with the computer and the information on the computer so as nobody can access to information that could put others at risk. And just basically walking carefully and looking to the sides. But I may not be the best case because I work in Mexico City, and although covering Mexico City has also become difficult, now that we're starting to cover drug cartels working in Mexico City, which was for many years like an isle, like the protected part of the country. This used to be a haven for reporters, and we pretty much work in safer conditions than reporters are that are covering local politics, because from what we know and the studies made so far, most of the threats and most of the attacks on reporters occur or come from the politicians who are involved with the cartels or the organized crime. So basically, but what I do see is I have colleagues who work in different parts of the country who have to work under the protection or so-called protection of police. So you have a reporter covering, imagine whichever story, going on a car with 3 huge bodyguards, armed bodyguards, and reporters who have to live with, a huge chain of locks on their doors that you can hardly believe anybody can live behind. So the lives of many have been affected. Many reporters have been affected. The chances that they do in a very good and solid investigative work can be affected, also because of that protection structure that has come about when there's a reporter at risk. So that's the mechanism the government has come up to. When a reporter is at risk, they come up with these protection strategies, which we don't know if they protect them or we just cripple journalism as well.
Okay, thank you. So continuing this sobering thread, Venkatesh, 48 journalists have been killed in India since 1992, 3 this year. And you've worked as a television journalist, you've worked as an online journalist, you have a broad view of the media landscape. Picking up on this thread from Xanic, is it more dangerous for journalists in cities such as Delhi or Bangalore, or is this a problem in other areas? Are the dangers more physical or legal? Give us the overview.
Yeah, I will say that threats against journalists in India, they fall under two broad categories, the acute threats and then chronic threats. And so acute threats are, you can't make generalizations saying, you know, urban areas are more dangerous or rural areas are more dangerous because of the people we've seen killed in the recent past in India. One was in Bangalore, and she was gunned down in front of a house in a very well-lit colony in a safe neighborhood. And then
this was the death
this was
a
Gauri
year ago?
Venkatesh, yes. And then Shujat Bukhari, who was killed in Kashmir. But the thing is, I would say that journalists in non-urban areas are under more threat, and I want to link that to the chronic threat. So the chronic threat is more low-key, but it's no less pernicious. For example, I would say that there are, again, under this chronic bucket, there are three broad threats. One is, 30% of all advertising revenue for most newspapers in India comes from the government. And when it comes from the government, it's not very difficult for governments to put journalists under pressure, and it leads to self-censorship. The second is, there is a saying in India that journalists were only asked to bend, but they crawled. So what happens is, in a scenario where in theory you have press freedom, the Indian Constitution guarantees press freedom, but because of government censorship and other forms of censorship, there is this tendency among journalists to not stick their necks out, which I think is pernicious, and because it comes amid a culture of fear. And India is, I think, 138 in the World Press Freedom Index, and geography and demography also plays a big role. For example, it's not easy for an Indian journalist in, let's say, Bangalore to help the Indian journalist in another part of the country because they're divided by language. There are 22 official languages, and they're also divided by geography, and the terrain is different, and the literacy levels are different. So the challenges just to uphold press freedom are many, and so acute and chronic both are problems.
Yeah. Okay. So Joel, now in Botswana, CPJ report there haven't been any journalists killed in recent years. However, there are substantial legal threats. Give us an understanding of what the media landscape is like in Botswana and some of the challenges of working there as an investigative journalist.
Yeah, basically, the situation is almost similar to what Venkatesh explained as the chronic example, in which we have a very litigious political aristocracy. The president, at least until April he left office, he had actually said he does not read, he has got no respect for private press, especially the critical press. The judiciary holds itself to be so subservient to government. Most of the litigation newspapers or private media loses the cases most of the time. And this creates a culture of self-censorship. And because the government is the main also provider of, I think it's 70% provider of advertising, it creates, government chooses to actually decide who to advertise with, and it creates direct starvation of the media. Then again, there'll be self-censorship because most of the media houses wants to survive.
So, to follow up on that, how have you, being managing director of an investigative journalism center, how do you deal with that threat? I mean, how do you and your organization resist such government pressure?
The advantage is that we don't rely on government for funding. At least we rely on George Soros and other funders. So we are kind of insulated, at least at the level of funding. So we don't need to get funding from government. But the biggest challenge happens to be surveillance on investigative journalists. tapping of phones, break-ins, and we do very little, the best that we can, including trying to protect our hardwares and software and really trying to provide physical security into our residences and always checking your shoulder if somebody's following you and things like that. But we are lucky we have partners around the world. We have OCCRP in Romania, which helps us with technical support. We have ICIJ in Washington.
And what is ICIJ?
Oh, the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists based in Washington that has been doing the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers and other major leaks. Normally when we are under threat, they are able, because they have the platforms, to amplify the concerns, and we tend to see a reduced level of threats normally.
Okay. Picking up on something that you mentioned, just this week, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Joel's organization, issued an advisory for journalists in more than 40 countries in terms of their security, especially on mobile devices, because of the proliferation of spyware which could be used to monitor their movements. So all of you work in environments where the potential for being spied on by government or other actors is there. How do you protect yourself? Let's start with Roman. What do you do in terms of security for your devices and for this, what you're working on?
Well, you know, the first rule about security is never talk about security if you want to be secure, right? So why would you tell, you know, people what you use? But let's assume, you know, that there is a lot of open source apps, which of course I don't use, but you know they might work for you. I don't know. I mean, you know, like Signal is a very good app for messaging and for calling. So it provides encrypted phone calls. Of course, I mean, there are some other, I mean, it depends on what kind of job you do. So let's say there is, Signal is good, but you know, it's bad because it still demands you to connect with your phone number. And say if our reporters work in Chechnya, even the fact that they have a number of somebody from Chechnya will become very dangerous for that person, which means that we need an app which allows you to connect, to create an account without the mobile number, and such apps exist as well. And I will not tell you their names, but you know they do exist. If you have some, you know, secret records or some leaks, it's of course would be cool to keep them in encrypted containers, such as Veracrypt, you know, a very good app which allows you to create those encrypted containers. Of course, it's good to encrypt your hard drive with a good password. So my account was hacked, my Gmail account was hacked 5 years ago, and the technology the Russian secret services used was pretty cool, you know. What they did, and that is, you know, actually what guys from Google tell me about it, but they didn't, you know, because they don't create, you know, Gmail for, they don't think that Russians will, by that time they didn't know that Russians will be so smart. So what they do, they just, you know, I had the recovery, probably each of you have the recovery phone number at your account, so if you forget your password, they will send the recovery code to your SIM card, which is very vulnerable, because what Russian secret services did, they cloned my SIM card, switched off my SIM card, and they got the recovery code on the cloned SIM card, and that's how they were able to hack my Gmail account. But you know what? I was not very upset, because 70% of my email is encrypted with PGP. And I think that, you know, guys from FSB were very unhappy when they got, you know, the whole Gmail stuff and it was encrypted and they couldn't decrypt it, you know. So there are plenty of cybersecurity things which everybody can use, and I would probably recommend you a very cool website which somehow summarizes all of them, and it's called Security in a Box. Securityinabox.probably.net. And there is a bunch of tools which we constantly, which some people constantly use, but not me.
Yeah. So we won't talk about security anymore because we shouldn't. So. Turning to Xanic. So freedom of the press doesn't just mean having the freedom to hold government accountable. It's also about being able to hold the powerful accountable. Sometimes that means companies like Walmart. You and David at the New York Times, you won the Pulitzer for your story on how Walmart used bribery I read that you filed more than 800 Freedom of Information requests and spent years working on that story. How do you even begin to tackle such a mammoth story and to navigate its complex angles?
Well, I had the fortune to have David Barstow as the head of the team, so that's how. But I think it's. I think what was very unique about the project is that the Freedom of Information law in Mexico, which now gives us access to documents and records in the hands of the government, was pretty new when we started the project. I mean, it had been around for probably 8 years, and you have had FOIA for so much longer. So what we had is the team. We had David Barstow's expertise in using the Freedom of Information Act in the U.S. with all its twists and turns. He knew like the shortcuts. He knew more about how bureaucracy thought and what they were thinking when they were when we asked them questions. He knew what it meant for a bureaucrat to be asked, to be confronted with that decision of giving or retaining information from a reporter. And on the other hand, we had my ingenuity, which was also good, and turned out. And also we had a law that turned out to be even better than the US FOIA law. The Mexican law basically sets deadlines that no one in the US has. You can wait for 6 months for a FOIA, for an answer in the US, and you have 20 working days in Mexico. So I think what we did is my knowledge of the Mexican bureaucracy and the way of thought, and David's expertise with FOIA and how this obligation to deliver records makes a bureaucracy work helped us a lot into understanding and making a strategy into how to find the very well hidden proof that there had been corruption in Mexico.
Okay, thank you. So picking up that thread, Venkatesh, so I'm going to throw out an acronym, and you can tell us what it means. What is RTI, and how does that help journalists in India in their work?
RTI is a landmark legislation that was passed in the early 2000s, and it stands for Right to Information, which is pretty similar to the Freedom of Information and the act you were describing. And in India, it's 30 working days, which is also pretty good. And the thing is, it was passed about 15, 16 years ago, and it led to the formation of RTI activists across the country. And in fact, if there is any community that is in more danger than journalists, it's the RTI activists who started filing these RTI requests through every level of government, local to national and state, and started getting information that was embarrassing to people who were in government. But what has happened in the last couple of years is that the new administration has sort of wised up and is making it difficult within the loopholes of the law to give information to journalists or anybody who's filing an RTI request. And so it's like there's a wave of RTI activists. They were attacked, but there's wave upon wave. But at the same time, now the current administration has stamped down on that, and then there is a sort of response to that, which is trying to get around the way the government does that. And it is still something that is taking shape as we speak.
Wow. So you focused in your work a lot on training journalists and workshops and that sort of thing. Is that one of the things you're trying to help journalists do to navigate this Byzantine landscape?
Increasingly, I just want to recall what Joel was saying in the previous panel, which is that it is no longer possible for a journalist or an RTI activist or a couple of journalists to have the kind of impact that they desire through a series of stories. It's more important for them to work in collaboration with other journalists, whether the other journalists are in the same organization or across organizations. So increasingly my work is focused on fostering this kind of collaboration. And in the last 4 to 5 months, for example, I've put together a coalition of newsrooms in India to gear up for the big election, the national election that's going to happen in 2019. And the idea is to sort of focus on disinformation, misinformation, other forms of information that is manipulated. And I'm happy to report that at this stage, a lot of organizations are enthusiastic about this.
That's great to hear. Let's take an example from Botswana. Joel has worked on several notable projects, including the Panama Papers, as we've mentioned. But another notable investigation involved uncovering how government funds were being misspent to build a huge retirement complex for the president. Despite the government in Botswana is mired in secrecy, and of course they didn't want that story told. How did you uncover it?
Maybe just briefly, let me also explain that out of the 54 African countries, only 18 have laws that promote access to information. And as we mentioned earlier, Ghana and South Africa are top up there. So Botswana doesn't have a law that promotes access to information that we call FOIA here. So what happens is that the public tends to trust the journalists so much that they believe when there is something going on, only the media can, especially private journalists, can really deal with their problems. So President Khama, his name is Khama, he retired in April this year. Ahead of his retirement, he was using the military to construct for himself, using taxpayers' money, an airstrip worth $6 million in the bush, in the middle of the country. Botswana has got vast tourism, and he was just on the edge of sort of a delta where there's a lot of tourism, and almost a villa or a mini, really paradise for himself. So the army was concerned that they are being made to do stuff for corruption, really. So we set out 600 miles to the place, and the long and short of the story is that when we were just about 5 miles, we got arrested by plainclothes officers who apparently happened to know what we were up to in the bush, and they stopped us and told us, where you are going, you are not supposed to go. They didn't even ask us where we are going. They told us it is not place to go there. They then interrogated us, I think, for 2 hours, but we managed during the interrogation to call one of the lawyers who is feared, and they got to know that we did that, and it really kind of balanced the scales in terms of the conversations in the bush, and they were carrying guns, driving expensive SUVs. So what they did finally was that they asked us to go back to the city, or wherever we came from. So what was striking is that we went to the nearest police station to report, because it was intimidation. Because what they did was they said, before they returned, they asked us to return. They said, you, Joel, and your colleague, who we are managing, the co-managing partner, no matter what happens in future, we are asking you to return, but in future, don't ever think of setting your foot here. Ooh. If you do, we will shoot you and kill you. And this is an officer of law with a gun that is owned by the state, and he's telling you that he will kill you. And at the time, my daughter was 3 months, and I told him, I have a child. He said, yeah, but you understand through the barrel of a gun, so what we will do is we will kill you, you will never see the child. So it was scary. We had to go to police station. And the officer was surprised that we actually mustered the courage to go to try to do a story of that nature. He said, what are you doing there? You guys, you are also, because this is the nature in Africa whereby presidents shouldn't be questioned up to a certain level because they are elders. So you should not be questioning elders. So we kind of gave up and went back to the city. But 2 months later, we engaged a US company called Digital Globe to get actually the satellite image of that compound, because we did not get there, we didn't take the pictures. So the story became bigger because we managed now to have a bird's eye view of the residence, which showed now the length of the airstrip, the extent of the project, the military trucks and the Bowsers busy at work. And the state did not like that. 2 months later, there was a serious break-in in our office. First, there was a visit by plainclothes officers saying they are just paying a visit, not very clear what they want. 2 days later, there was a break-in. which we reported and normally dies down, and they are still investigating up to now.
Wow.
So this is the nature of things that are very normal in Botswana.
Well, thank you for sharing. My next question is for Roman. You've heard the Panama Papers mentioned several times. Roman, of course, worked on the Panama Papers. He worked on the subsequent project, the Paradise Papers. His work over a 5-year period revealed the disappearance of $1 billion from Russia's budget that ended up in offshore accounts and shell companies throughout Europe. So Roman, in a country such as Russia, how do you even begin to get the records, to follow the money, to track down such a story?
Well, first of all, part of this billion appeared in the US. They used 20 million to buy properties on Manhattan. So, some of the dirty money, goes to this as well. And there was a civil forfeiture case started after that investigation, and which ended up just recently. Believe it or not, Russia is very open in public records. So we've got company records, we've got court records, and actually some of the databases are even better than here in the US, because I constantly use Pacer, and sometimes I spend half of my salary on on getting all those records from the American database, of course. So if people from Pacer are watching this video, guys, do something, because we gotta lose all of money in Russia, just to read your records. Well, in Russia, and still, you just can search by the party name. Well, in Russia, you can search by any keyword. So our open record, we're very good. We're very good at open records. What they try to do sometimes, when there was a series of investigations against secret services, and after which I was hacked, what they tried to do, they tried to close the property register, but then they suddenly realized that if they do that, the number of frauds in the real estate, it will just it will go high, and they invented something smarter, as they think. So they started deleting the names of the officials from the records. So you say you can go somewhere at the Moscow region, you will see a very big, house, and if you want to check who is the owner of the house, you'll get just, the line saying that there is a physical person owning the house, I don't know what they do with Vladimir Putin, maybe they say, I don't know, metaphysical person owning the house, or, But those properties which belong to officials or their relatives, they just delete the names. But records are still available, and we are very open in this sense. 70% of stories I do come actually from open records.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this time, we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So. Okay, so one of the first questions we'll go to Alejandra Xanic. You've worked with many news organizations, but as an independent journalist, a freelancer, why be independent? Does it make your job easier or more difficult?
Well, I thought when I started being an independent journalist, what I thought is that first I was very shy. I was too shy to look for an actual job. I moved to the capital city and I was totally panicked with big newsrooms. And but it really what made me an independent journalist is the idea that I could probably make more in-depth investigation on my own what I could do in a media organization where there's basically no room for investigation. So that was the reason that took me. And what happened is that in the end, I actually did more of the work I didn't want to do just to pay the rent, but I was able to subside my own investigations and bring some sense to my room for my passion. But what I found right now is that you have, I think I started being a freelancer when nobody was a freelancer, and officials in Mexico, you would say you're an independent journalist, and we would go like, independent from what? It's like, but now you have lots and lots of independent journalists, and I think that what the leitmotif there is that they're all wanting to open space for investigative pieces or for stories that are not finding their way through the mainstream media. As happens in Botswana and from what I hear in India too, the big issue in Mexico, apart from organized crime, is the lack of independent media. We don't have business women and businessmen in the media who have interesting or have innovated or have explored new avenues to sustain their business other than government advertising. And that has really cut the freedom of speech very, very harshly. There are zones of silence in Mexico where things are just not published because the owners of the media, either because the drug cartels are too big of a threat, or because the media owners are just unwilling to let some stories go. So more and more you have a huge crowd of freelance reporters trying to get those stories out.
Okay, thank you. So our next question, and several of you may want to respond to this, but we'll start with Ramon. What about increasing threats to informants and witnesses? Are these threats making it difficult to find sources?
Yeah, that's probably the first time today when I'll try to get serious, because I mean, my main concern are people we talk to, because they are in. This is the most dangerous. This is the most dangerous situation for them, since there are not so many independent media left in Russia. Some of people really risk their lives to talk to us, and that's when I talk to my reporters. That's the only topic where I really get serious. And I said that, look, this is your responsibility to save their lives, and this is your responsibility to make them feel safe. And you know what? I mean, it's not so difficult, to be honest. I mean, it is difficult, but if you follow certain rules and if you treat it seriously, none of my sources, as we do it in Russia, none of my sources has ever been exposed or say, faced any threats and problems because we follow the procedure. While I know examples in Russia where people just didn't how do you say it normally? Didn't care about their sources, and some of their sources were imprisoned, and so I know some examples when people even were killed because they didn't care about the security. So yeah, protect sources is point one in our modus operandi in my office.
Anyone else?
Well, just want to offer a general comment, because increasingly the media in India, and I think around the world as well, is under pressure for to be more and more transparent, and it's a good thing. But the big dilemma is, what do you do with informers? What do you do with whistleblowers? And in India, there's a whistleblowing law, but it's not enough. And the question is, there is increasing pressure to name your sources, except in cases where naming sources is going to be a serious danger. So I see, from an observer perspective, I see these two movements clashing. And to increase credibility, there's this tendency in a lot of Indian news in which a reporter will say, sources say, unnamed sources say. And so I think that has been abused a lot in some cases, and in some cases there are journalists who are doing a lot of valuable work working with informers and whistleblowers, and they need to keep their identities under wraps under any circumstance. Sometimes the pressure to reveal sources ends up compromising this situation where witnesses need to be protected at all costs.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we're drawing close to the end of our time together this evening. I have one more question that I'll throw open to the panel. We've heard about physical dangers. We've heard about legal threats. How do you maintain hope as a journalist in the face of all that you endure? What keeps you going?
Yeah, if I may start, you tend to know that what you're doing is good, you're in public interest, and you know that if you can't do it, who else will? So, and there are youngsters who look up to you, young journalists, and you need to do things right so that they they develop the confidence to do things right as well. So to me, that is the biggest motivation.
Thank you.
So I became a journalist in 2006, 12 years ago, and I was really an idealist, right? So I believe that journalism can really change at least my country for the better. So it's gone like a long time ago. I don't believe that we can change something for better, and I'm not kidding. I'm cynical. Being cynical today in Russia is saving your time, right? So I'm cynical in this sense. Simultaneously, if people don't need it, then they just don't need it. What keeps me doing this job? Just one thing, I love it. So I really love the process. I love the process of finding the story. I love the process of publishing the story. I love the process of writing. So I just love my job, and that's what keeps me going on and continuing, the job.
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, but I have to agree with Roman there that I'm quite skeptical now, and the reason for that is, there's so much information. There's information overload that's coming from all directions for your average citizen, that it's very, very difficult to find the journalism that not just informs but also educates. And for those reasons, because of a combination of technology and WhatsApp is a major source of happiness in India, but it's also a major source of problems. And so I see problems for journalism multiplying, but at the same time, what gets me going is that happy confluence of what am I good at doing, what I like doing, and what frankly gets me paid to do. So I'll keep going.
Xanic, any closing comments?
Well, I guess what keeps me going is I have the feeling that in Mexico we have a big debt with the public, with the audience. I think we've fed them with very, very lousy work for many, many years. The media in Mexico were for many years like the loudspeakers for the powerful. It was just quotes and quotes and quotes and quotes, no end. And so I think I do believe in the public service of journalism, and I do think we are in very big debt. And I do hope that we can engage readers and audiences if we just go to a shift to another way of doing journalism. And I'm seeing more and more of that, and that's what has me very excited.
Thank you. We'll have to leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking